I'm Jim Kelsey. I'm president of KW Engineering in Oakland, California is our headquarters, and we've got offices around a few other places in the country, Long Beach, Salt Lake, Chicago, New York. And I'm here today to talk to you about upcoming changes to Standard 211, which is ASHRAE's first energy audit standard. And here, because I chaired that standard. So I've been doing energy audits for the last 20 years since I started my firm and before. It's a subject that's near and dear to my heart that I've been involved with for a long time. So I'm happy to say that we have a standard ready for print. I actually have an advance copy in my possession. It's going to be in bookstores by the summer. And so hopefully in today's session I can tell you a little bit about it so that you'll care enough to use the standard and hope that you find it useful. So jumping right in, this does get you CEU credits for attending the course, and I've already given a plug for KW. We just, like I said, we just turned 20 this year, so I think we're going to make it. I'm happy about that. The course description, the central piece of Standard 211 is defining procedures for conducting energy audits. And those procedures have been around for a long time. The level 1, 2, 3 nomenclature has been around a long time. We're trying to clarify that so that we all are on the same page when we talk about levels 1, 2, and 3. And I'll let you read the learning objectives. Hopefully we'll get to all of that. And first of all, I just want to, in the words of the late, great Yogi Berra, thank everybody that made this day necessary. We started with a standard at ASHRAE because we felt actually cities were coming to us expressing a need for an energy audit standard because cities like New York, who were implementing mandatory energy audit programs, had no standard. And if we weren't going to write one, then they were going to write it themselves, and we didn't want that to happen. So we started in about, am I thumping? We started in about 2012 with this effort to update the standard. ACA came on board, the Air Conditioning Contractors Association, and it is ANSI accredited. And we had support from ACG as well. ACG's participation was instrumental in changing the standard, and I think for the better. So I want to thank them for having me here today too, to this great conference. So the energy audit levels really started with this publication, which came out in 2004, which was the first procedures for commercial building energy audits. That's the document that sort of popularized levels 1, 2, and 3. Then in Roman numerals, we since ditched that. The standard, or it's not a standard, it was a special publication, but it was treated like a standard. People started adopting that 1, 2, 3 nomenclature as if it were a standard. That publication also included some audit forms, some guidance about how to do audits, and roughly put in place the framework that we're still working from. In 2011, we updated that book to what we call the Green Book, which is the Procedures for Commercial Building Energy Audits. That came out in 2011. It also became a de facto standard. It was adopted by LEED as sort of their, well, you could get LEED points if you did a ASHRAE Level 2 audit. And the parts that define the audit levels was pretty much a short piece of that book. It's like 5 or 6 pages that defined the audit levels. It also includes a lot of kind of good supporting information about best practices, how to do audits, how to gather data. It included a lot of free information, data collection forms for specific types of equipment, some ideas about energy efficiency measures, checklists for simulations, and some discussions of other topics like how to get a good energy audit done, how to find a contract. That publication is still out there and is still used to define the audit levels. The problem was that the Green Book had way too much leeway in it. In fact, the text of the first edition specifically said, there is a lot of room for wiggle in between these audit levels. But when people were setting bids based on those audit levels, if there's room for wiggle, then you have wiggle in your bids, which is a bad thing. You don't want apples and oranges bidding. So we really felt like we needed to replace that with something with greater rigor. Also wanted to point out the EMA's Energy Management Guideline, which is also refers to the ASHRAE audit levels as part of its guidance. It's a great publication. I can't believe that it's free. My hat's off to the volunteers that put this together. It's a good resource for, kind of background information just downloaded off of the EMA's website. So we were kind of, I'd say, victims of our own success with this energy audit level 1, 2, and 3 designations. The reason I say that is because the idea was so simplistic that people felt like they didn't have to actually read the book to understand or think that they knew what ASHRAE Level 1, 2, and 3 audits were. And a lot of people had kind of very specific and different ideas about what should be included in those. And then you also hear, people making up the occasional Level 1.5 or 1+, which is when they want to pay for a Level 1 audit and they want to get a Level 2 audit. But the idea caught on, and so we wanted to run with it. And in fact, in the standard, we even dropped the titles of those audit levels. They used to have audit level titles that were supposed to give you an idea of the scope, but we dropped that because it's too hard to give it a title without, well, in standard language, basically, without changing what your meaning is. So why write a standard? Like I mentioned, the leeway was a big problem. We didn't want people comparing apples and oranges bids. We also had cities coming up with their own energy audit templates or recommendations. And we didn't want those to be different all around the country, or let alone burden those cities with that work that's really not theirs. They're not experts in it. My great hope, I've yet to see this materialize, but my great hope is that if we're all kind of on the same page as to what constitutes an energy audit, that we'll be able to develop our templates so that I don't have a different audit for a different client or a different city, that we kind of narrow the playing field. I hope that there's some efficiency gains from that as well, and we'll talk about some other ways that we're trying to achieve those efficiency gains. So when you develop a standard, one of the things I was warned about early on is to avoid talking about costs, because what you're supposed to be doing is coming up with rules about how to do something fairly. But I'd say that in the case of this standard, it's practically impossible to not think about cost when you're writing the standard. It was in the back of all of our minds, like how we define that standard is going to have cost impacts on our services. And many of the folks that were on my ASHRAE, on the Standard 211 committee, were energy auditors. There was probably 3/4 of us have a background in energy auditing. And there's this trade-off that I often talk about around energy audits that I think anybody who's done this is aware of. It's, you want the level of detail, rigor, accuracy, minimize risk. All of those things are good, but they also have a big impact on cost. The more time you spend in a building, you're expensive, and the more time you spend on an activity, the pricier it gets. And what we didn't want to do was to regulate a bunch of kind of busy work, stuff that wasn't, that was in the standard because it was a nice to have, or it made sense for some buildings. I think of it a little bit like a cost curve. We have a resource out here, and it's energy efficiency. And the cost of that resource varies depending on how deep you have to dig to get it. There are these very kind of light, simple things that you can do in a building like HVAC scheduling, which are very cheap to implement and have a big impact. But then you go kind of up the cost curve. Lighting controls is maybe something that's a little more expensive. It also has a big impact. Then you get into a lighting retrofit. That's more cost when you're changing out stuff. You get into, replacing boilers and chillers. You have a very, very expensive but very big, efficient resource. So you constantly have to figure out for a particular client, where am I on that curve? What is their stomach for investment? And tailor your level of effort to that. So we wanted the standard to be written in a way that allowed that judgment by the energy auditor and allowed them to meet the needs of their clients. Because if we're not doing that, then why do an energy audit, right? So just for some comparative cost numbers, when I say energy efficiency is a resource, I mean utilities are treating it that way, and here's our competition. And in today's world, coal with required carbon capture is the most expensive resource. And then you can see why we're getting into a lot of combustion turbines and combined cycle plants, and solar PV has gotten a lot cheaper, and wind is super competitive. Geothermal is cheap, and energy efficiency is sort of artificially held down here. Because, like I said, for every project, you're going to set how deep you dig in order to keep the value of that resource. If the value of that resource gets above solar and wind, or the cost of energy, then it doesn't have a payback. It's not worth doing. So at least from the economic standpoint. And here's the implicit assumption that I hear a lot of people make around the cost of energy audits. Some people will say you get what you pay for. And it was very much in the back of our minds writing the standard that the qualifications of the person doing the energy audit were very important in terms of the value that you get out of it. And the implicit assumption that a lot of people make, if you say you get what you pay for, that means if it costs half as much, I get half as much. And I just want to point out that with energy audits, I don't think that's the case, because there's a point where you fall off a cliff where if I pay half as much, I don't get half as much back, I get nothing, or I get essentially nothing of value. We've all seen energy audits like this that have vague hand-waving recommendations to do things that the owner, after they read it, doesn't have a clear idea of what to do or how to do it. So I want to name that the Kelsey curve and just promote it around the country. So this is the purpose statement of the standard. Every standard starts with a title, purpose, and scope. Really, try not to read it off here, but the purpose was to define the audit levels, provide a common scope that we could bet on, establish consistent quality methodologies, and minimum reporting requirements. So, and with energy auditing that has, to date, never had any regulation around it. This required a lot of shifting gears on the part of the people in the conversation from a good energy audit to a standard meeting energy audit. So these were not goals. It was not goals to establish best practice or to try and come up with a comprehensive list of energy efficiency measures, although there's a research effort just kicking off on that within ASHRAE as we speak. It wasn't a goal to have overly prescriptive methods or recommendations. We wanted to leave people the latitude to approach the buildings like they needed to be approached. There's a certain amount of following your nose that most energy auditors do because they know where the savings are. I often get this complaint comes mostly from regulators, I'll say broadly, that if I have 3 energy auditors go do 3 audits on the same building, I get 3 different lists of recommendations. Well, yeah, of course, they have different areas of specialty, they have different prior experience. Nobody would expect 3 different designers on a new building to come up with with the same system for a given building. Why would you require that of a retrofit project? So we tried to not make consistency a goal. We did not address virtual or remote audits. I just want to do a quick poll just for myself because I have a captive audience. How many people in the room have had seen a product of a virtual or remote audit that they thought was really a great thing, valuable? Yay, say yay, everybody. Oh, man. Okay, everybody who kind of resents these things and think that they're you can't do an energy audit without going to a building, then you say, boo, okay, or just mumble. All right, that's what I suspected. I mean, I'm not for them or against them. I think there's probably some value there, and I certainly don't want to be, the curmudgeon in the room who there's great new technology out there and I'm against it, I don't want that to be my role in life. I think with billing data, interval billing data, there's great diagnostic information in there that we're going to get better at harvesting with computers. But we still need engineers to go and look at the stuff and see what's going on. Yeah, garbage in, garbage out, he's saying. That's true, but we have good data.
That's assuming that what you're getting from the AS or whatever is actually calibrated.
Right, let's postpone this discussion to the end because it could take an hour just like in a heartbeat. So we did not address virtual audits and frankly, they never came to the table. So we didn't include that in the standard. We also didn't want to try to prescribe any actions for owners. It's none of our business what measures are implemented, why they want to do things. There's also a kind of a common story that we tell ourselves around energy audits that, here's the story. You do the energy audit, you present the owner with a list of recommendations, and they choose the cost-effective ones and proceed. That's not how most projects happen, actually. That's not how most people make decisions. They don't always pick the measures that have the best economics. They pick the measures that they like, that they want. I want a new chiller, I'm going to do that. Or it's going to be way quieter if I install a DX system or a split system. So anyway, that's my own little pontificating on that point. So we didn't want to prescribe any actions for owners. And so we had to remind folks many, many times that the standard sets the minimum requirement for what you can call an ASHRAE level audit. It's not a best practice guide. All right. Our scope is this big long phrase, which is kind of code speak for commercial buildings and large multifamily. But to be consistent with other standards, we chose this other scope. And then the standard is organized. I won't go through this in detail, but title, purpose, and scope. We have some definitions, which was a lot of work. There's a brief compliance section. 5 and 6 are the meat of the standard. So this is procedures and reporting, which is how you have to do stuff and what you have to deliver to your client. So that's where the real meat of the standard is. Then we've got references and then all of the annexes. So in code speak, normative means required. So there are the normative forms. So there's a required compliance form. There is a section on savings calculations on how those should be done. It's rather broad, but and then there are the reporting forms. So there is a small body of forms, and I'll show you a few of them that you have to do. These are reporting forms, not data collection forms. We don't care how you collect your data. You do that however you want. But there's a minimum set of reporting. And then we've got some other kind of informative stuff, sample outlines, a section on data exchange, which I'll tell you a little bit about model calibration, and then risk assessment. But that's all sort of just for your information. It doesn't have to be there. It doesn't have to be done. Okay, starting with level 0. This is kind of the prerequisites for a level 1 audit. That hasn't changed much. You need to present your billing data. You that includes metered and, quote, delivered energy. So if you get a coal shipment or a propane, you have to report that. You have to break down the costs of fuels in some kind of a pie chart or table. You have to report the energy use intensity and the energy cost index, and I'll go into some details on that. And you have to do some benchmarking. So you have to benchmark your site. So this is actually borrowing from Standard 105, which I think Dennis was one of the authors of, or the chair of 105. So we have, okay, one of the members with us today, and one of my 211 members and major contributors. But this diagram basically shows the relationship between energy at the site and energy at the building. And the way that it was defined in 105 is that if you include the energy produced by on-site renewables, then that E, for purposes of your EUI or energy use intensity, that E includes solar or PV or on-site, other on-site generation. If you use E of the site, then you have to meter, E of the site takes the net effect of that production. So how I think of this is E-building is basically the E for the energy use of your building. E-site is the whole thing, which includes the generation that you do on site. So with E-site, you could have a very low energy use building because it had a great big photovoltaic system on it and a crappy dog building. E-building doesn't let you get away with that. You have to have an efficient building to have a low E on a building scale. So why didn't we require E-building? Well, not all buildings are metered that way. You can't always subtract the energy production of the solar, and we didn't want you to have to install meters in order to just be able to report an EUI. So we made it optional. You just have to say whichever one you're reporting, and you can report either one. And that's in this table, E, which is one of the required forms where you'll report that. So that kind of begs the question, is this an energy efficient building with single pane louvered windows and window shakers and solar on the top? If you use E-site, it is. If you use e-building, it isn't. We have to leave that discussion for another day. I mean, there's a whole philosophical topic there of like, well, do we care? You know, if solar is cheaper than doing new windows in this building, maybe you should just do solar. So anyway, I'll leave that for another day or for our other informed discussion at the end. We gave lots of options for benchmarking. Pretty much any of these that you already know. ASHRAE Standard 100 has benchmarking tables. CBEX has tables. CIBSE. There's REX for multifamily. Energy Star, of course, if you're already doing Energy Star for your building, that's an easy way to do it. DOE has their building performance database, which is a great one because you can set your own filters on like building type and geography and weather and stuff like that. So that's a strong candidate there. Or your favorite one, you can benchmark against your other facilities if that's what works for you. You just have to say what it is that you do. So here's a screenshot of Building's performance database, one of my favorites. Then there's the whole other argument around EUIs is, and this comes mostly out of New York, where, is a low EUI even a good thing? Is that a goal worth shooting for? So my illustration of that is looking at these two buildings, which one is the, quote, green building? Well, you can tell the one on the left is the green building because it's got modern furniture and plants, and it's very architecturally just, it's so. But actually, the one on the left has single pane windows and non-insulated CMU walls, and I don't see any insulation on the roof either, so we don't know, and it's got no people in it. So how is that efficient? Whereas this trading floor, that's going to have a sky-high EUI, but it's got tons of people working in it, producing enormous value. Like, do you want to penalize them for the economic activity that they're generating in that building? Do you want to penalize a building because it has twice as many employees as the building next to it? Is that green? So, other questions for talking about later that I'm not going to try and settle. But for the time being, for the standard, we're going to report EUIs so we can start looking at it. So then we have level 1 requirements. So level 1 is, my idea of level 1 is it's basically scoping. You're trying to figure out if there's a lot of potential there or not. And so what you do should be brief, low cost, and just that. And frankly, the way that level 1 was written before left a lot of room for clients asking for costs and savings impacts for level 1 measures. And I just don't feel like it's right to ask somebody to do that. Once you say a number, that's the number for a client. And so what engineers do is they go way over budget and try to figure out, at least my guys, or guys and gals, they will go way over budget on level 1 with numbers because you don't want to give them the wrong number. You have to do, then you're doing a level 2, right? So we wanted that ambiguity taken away. So we went to qualitative assessment of measures only. You have to come up with a list of measures, and you have to say, are they a high, a medium, or a low payback, or high, medium, low cost? Here's the table that you have to fill out. And just to summarize, that's the answers that you want in a level 1. I want high, medium, or low cost, high, medium, or low savings, high, medium, low ROI, and high, medium, or low priority. And I'll take applause for that at the end. So, level 2 didn't change that much, except it got more tightly specified. Level 2 is what I really think of as an energy audit. You want site-specific costs, site-specific savings. You want to know if there's incentives there, what my bottom line cost and payback is going to be, what I should do, and how much it's going to cost. The areas that we were careful about excluding from our scope were things like IAQ, IEQ. We don't want to encumber energy audits with the cost and or responsibility of hazardous material audits. So we basically came up with language that I would summarize by saying, if you see something, say something. You know, if somebody on site tells you about something that you know is a hazardous condition, you need to report that, which, you know, I consider a responsibility of anybody that has a PE anyway. That's just an ethical obligation of being at the site. But that we didn't want to extend that reach and encumber that cost. Yeah. You're required to write it in the report. We didn't say where, but yeah. Level 2 changes. We added a very fundamental version of quality assurance and quality control because we see, you know, terrible mistakes made out there. We added a requirement for at least a qualitative look at distributed energy sources. And we had the data forms standardization that I mentioned before. And we had some requirements around the calculations. Basically, the idea there is that you need to use the same method for determining your savings as you did in your QAQC and you did in your, you know, energy balance or what you call a end-use disaggregation. So here's how I like to see savings done. There are lots of shortcuts, but I like, you know, just the standard old school base case, proposed case, the difference is my savings. As long as you do things this way, you can break out the base case, and then that number becomes the basis of your disaggregation. So that feeds into your other analysis. It has to hang together. I think, you know, folks who do good energy audits, you're already doing this. So, but, you know, when you're setting a minimum bar, you really have to say everything explicitly. And so in our reporting forms, we did require this basic level of QAQC, where I have to say, you know, how my savings compare to my base case energy use of that measure. And then, of course, you get into some complicating things. We're trying to not make this too complicated, but, you know, some measures will, for instance, increase my fan energy and decrease my chiller plant energy. But we're just trying to do a rough comparison. We're not pointing any fingers here, but as an energy auditor, we just say, you know, like, hey, if that number is 50% of my end use, highlight it. You need to explain that. You know, it's a great project, it's great savings, or whatever. If it's more than the base case energy use, you got a problem. And so you have to at least make this very fundamental comparison. We did require a distributed energy assessment. It's qualitative. Basically, just say, you know, how big a solar PV might be. I think we left an out for, you know, if the owner says, I'm not interested, then, you know, they're the bottom line on that. But we did require at least a qualitative assessment of one renewable resource and one distributed resource, like cogen. Move on. And then we had our required auditing forms, or reporting forms, sorry. And we tried to make these as kind of easy to use as possible. We didn't want to go into too much detail on systems or cause people a lot of extra work. So hopefully this is the kind of stuff that you're already reporting to your client. Now we're just saying, just put it in this form and it's done. And you do have to report your, you know, basic energy consumption, your disaggregation or end-use breakdown, all of that. And then level 3. So I always think of level 3, the point of level 3 is minimizing risk and really working towards implementation. So you're trying to you're trying to think through the project, get better costs, lower risk by kind of getting up to your elbows in it. So we required that your analysis either include measured energy use or simulation modeling, hourly modeling, or you can use engineering calculations. We do require schematic diagrams for measures. This is basically just so that you have to think through the project and prove that it can be done, it's buildable. We required any envelope measures to use simulation, because there's really no other way to do envelope measures in spreadsheets that isn't essentially an hourly simulation. And the costs for a level 3 have to be from somebody willing to do the work or based on previous projects, which is probably how you're doing your costs already anyway. We do require life cycle cost analysis for level 3, so you have to report either the net present value of energy efficiency measures or measure like SIR is what the federal government requires for savings to investment ratio, but those include lifetime impacts. And the other requirement of level 3 is some basic risk analysis. So basically, you're going to identify the major knobs on your calculations and twiddle those major knobs a little bit and see how much the output varies, if I can describe it that way. This is a Spiderplot. That's an example of ways to present the results of that kind of analysis, is you look at the change in simple payback as you twiddle with a variable. So here, the green line, I'm twiddling my motor cost. The red line, I'm varying my assumption of motor runtime. So if I have a longer runtime, I have a shorter payback, that kind of thing. The other thing that we did in the annex, one of the informative annexes, is recommend BuildingSync as a means for data exchange. And so we've never had a real foundation for data exchange in the energy audit world. And I can't tell you how many reports that I have PDFs of or calculations stored away, but we don't have them. Why can't I have a consistent report that I can shoot that to my utility and they can tell me what my incentives are based on that file? If we have a common file format, essentially. So BuildingSync is taking a crack at that. Technically, it's an XML schema. So it's extensible markup language is what XML stands for. And think of it like a language, not a tool. God knows we don't need any more databases. It's not a database. It's a means of communicating among different databases. So it's a language. And the easiest way to understand it is comparing it to HTML. Most of you probably know a little HTML by now, just to be a modern person. But HTML is a markup language also. If I follow this document here, you can probably tell me what that screen's going to look like. What's going to be on my screen when I run this HTML through my browser? Yeah, it's going to have a title at the top that says HTML examples, and it's going to have a heading that says, here's my text. It's fairly easy to do. You just bracket things with HTML's versions of parentheses. So here's the body of my page, and here's the end of the body. It just has a slash in front of it. BuildingSync is just as simple as that. And the reason why I think it's powerful is exactly why we used it for HTML. I mean, we had bulletin boards, which were essentially databases, on the web until about 93, 94. And then Mozilla came out with a browser that would read HTML, and then all of a sudden, we have the World Wide Web, because we've got all this means of slinging data around and showing it on screens consistently. So our great hope is that now we'll be able to do that with building data using BuildingSync. And so here's an example of BuildingSync code. That's all of the annotation, but you won't need to know that. And what that tells me is I've got a pump, and that pump's got a VFD on it. So it's as simple as that. So BuildingSync has already been implemented with the forms that we developed from 211. So the folks at the national labs have come up with an interpreter that takes the data out of the reporting forms and puts it into BuildingSync. And then you can do things like, there's an optional reporting form within our forms for using DOE's asset score. So asset score is a tool that you can use to basically score the assets of the building using, I think it runs Energy Plus in the background based on some assumptions about your building. It's a quickie modeling tool. Yeah. Yes, BEADS is the larger building energy data specification, and then BuildingSync is an implementation of that more narrow schema to energy auditing in building. So it does sit under BEADS, yes. Yeah. It's not software, it's a schema. Yeah, it's like a dictionary for a language. So BEADS is the greater dictionary of like English, and then BuildingSync is the definition of how each of those words is going to be spoken, sort of. I may be stretching my analogy a little bit, but it's, yeah. I'm certainly stretching my expertise. So, but here's what you can do with it. You can take your energy audit forms from ASHRAE and just port those right over into asset score and do an asset score model of that building. Now that may be kind of a crappy model, but it's a start anyway, and you haven't lost all of the data that you just put into your audit forms. The other things you can do, and they're testing this out in San Francisco, is that you can take that BuildingSync data and upload it to their mandatory auditing form database. So that should save us work, right? And then, yeah, and you can output from asset score to Energy Plus. Anyway, it's supposed to make it easier for us to move this data around so we don't have data dead ends, which are bad news. I think of databases as dead ends. What are the tricky parts? Well, it's hard to, BuildingSync is hard to define, and I'm sure that, the folks who did BIM found this also, that, and BuildingSync is not BIM. BIM is way, way, way more detailed than BuildingSync needs to be, and it has a different emphasis. You come up on some questions of like, well, how do I define things? Do I want to define measures? Do I give the user control to call a measure anything they want it to? Because then the data sort of has less value to it, but you have the freedom to do whatever you want. It's hard to decide like how narrow to filter that stuff. But there's some fairly simple things like, a boiler is a boiler, and a hot water loop is a hot water loop, and I want to know some basic data about that. The other tricky part is that, there's no value to this if nobody uses it. So I hope you use it, and we certainly plan on it. It's not that hard to implement with software folks. So some of the things that we didn't prescribe, we tried to limit the burden and increase options for owners. Owners do things for, I think I said this already, energy efficiency for dollar cost savings is overrated. That's not why people make decisions. And even in the regulated energy efficiency world, we have this term non-energy saving benefits, which everybody else in the world just calls benefits. They're like, that's why they do it. They don't see it as a non-energy saving thing. So anyway, we didn't want to require people to to narrow what they wanted to do. Compliance is very simple. We basically, your qualified energy auditor signs off on, that we followed the methods of sections 5 and 6, and here's my name, and that's it, really. The tricky part of this was deciding who's qualified to do energy audits. So my steady, I've asked this of a lot of people over the last 6 years or so that we developed this, and basically the answer that you get is, in effect, I am. Whoever you ask says, whatever your definition is, it should include me. So we had to come up with something besides that. And our first draft did not include EMA's EMP certification, which we didn't know about. It wasn't villainous or, ASHRAE, trying to be ASHRAE or something. I mean, people still talk about ASHRAE like it's a person. It's like 50,000 people, But it was brought to our attention that we should consider including it. And so through the collaborative process, we got to that end. And so this is the big definition for who's qualified to do an energy audit. And it's all predicated on this notion of AHJ, or the authority having jurisdiction. So that can be, in the case of a city requiring you to do an energy audit, then the city is the AHJ. If it's a building owner asking you to comply with the standard, the building owner is the AHJ. So these are things I had to learn through this whole standard writing process that I never really wanted to know, but you got to get there to do it. So our primary requirement is you have to have some experience. If you've done 10 audits in your career, you're good forever. If you've done 5 in the last year, then you're good. And so that means that you have to do audits that were supervised by somebody else. And it doesn't have to be, it's not circular. Your prior experience can be with auditors who were not qualified energy auditors. Otherwise, we'd have no basis to start from. So anyway, big qualification is that you meet the DOE's Better Buildings Workforce Guidelines for either an energy manager or an energy auditor. So there are 2 of those. And EMP, I just checked today, it has shown up on the DOE's website, so EMP does fall under that Better Buildings Workforce Guidelines, and it's live on the site saying so. Or, and these are ors, or a licensed professional engineer or licensed contractor specifically approved to conduct energy audits by the AHJ. And then the final one is, anybody that the AHJ says, which kind of goes without saying, but we said it anyway. Because the AHJ is the person who's sort of enforcing the standard. So that was the big contentious issue that we got resolved over time and was really the last thing on our docket before the standard will hit the streets. So publishing is in progress. It will be at the ASHRAE bookstore at the Houston meeting this summer and online probably earlier than that if you just want to buy the PDF. If you want to know when the standard comes out, give me your card and I'll put you on my list. The old green book, a chunk of that essentially becomes redundant now or overlaps with the standard. So regulators will have to say, are you talking about level 1, 2, and 3 in the green book, or are you talking about level 1, 2, and 3 in the standard? My hope is that they'll adopt, folks like LEED and cities will adopt the standard, and it seems likely. We had folks from the city of New York that sat on the committee to produce the standard. So the Green Book is being updated as sort of a user's guide. And the forms, the normative forms, ASHRAE has already decided they're going to post those on the web for free. So you can use the forms without buying the standard. And that will allow us kind of the ability to update the forms more often because I'm sure that we didn't get it perfect the first time, and we're going to require to do that. And I think that's it. So I'll open it up for questions, and my favorite speaker's words. If you ask me anything I don't know, I'm not going to answer, but I'll open it up for questions. Yes?
Yeah, we've got a microphone for the questions here, so yeah, we got about 10 minutes. So,
Does that XML transfer take place in the forms? I mean, how does that technologically get encoded into XML?
It doesn't yet happen in the forms. DOE has a tool which I'm sure they will make available, but they haven't yet. We're still tweaking with the forms and still tweaking with that to make it more seamless. Yeah.
Thank you. So, how does BuildingSync relate to Kobe? Is it competing, or does it support its use?
Relate to
Kobe?
Kobe? I don't know Kobe.
Okay.
What's
It's an
Kobe?
existing standard that describes system types and configurations that it's kind of an independent entity floating out there as far as I know, but an already kind of evolved resource of how you designate a type of equipment with its attributes.
Right.
On the surface, it looks like it's competing with.
Is it an XML schema?
Yes, I believe it is.
Huh. Well, interesting. I wasn't
okay.
aware of it. Yeah.
I wasn't sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I didn't develop BuildingSync. I just tried to coordinate with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question on the BuildingSync as well, because it's not the DOE program. It's a private LLC that has the BuildingSync, but yet BEADS is the DOE commission, taxpayer paid for, and it has the schema already built into it. It's not just a taxonomy. It actually has the schema built into it. So I'm wondering why, in a standard, you'd go with something that's from a private entity rather than from...
No, it's not private.
Well, it's a consortium.
BuildingSync came from the national labs.
Yeah, BEADS came out of LBNL.
Yes, and as did BuildingSync. Or BuildingSync, it was coordinated among the various labs. So NREL
Right.
and PNNL and LBNL.
Okay, but I went to the website and it's not part of the Department of Energy, so it looks a little weird to have that included into a standard.
Yeah, I
When
honestly,
BEADS already
but it
exists.
doesn't have a commercial home, and it was developed under BEADS. So the details of that I don't know, but it was supposed to be, BEADS was supposed to be the overarching thing, and then BuildingSync falls under that.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
here, hang on, so other people can hear your question.
Is this a standard or guideline? You said there is an enforcement. Who's going to enforce it? Who's going to enforce me to follow this?
It depends. It is a standard. It's not a guideline. Those are technically different
Okay.
things. The AHJ, whoever that is. So if a city or if a building is required to do an energy audit and you have to meet their, and they say we're adopting the standard for the program, then the city is the enforcer of the standard.
Or Caesar Entertainment? That's the whole. They oversee the whole.
If it's the owner of the building says, thou shalt use this as a minimum, or quote based on this as a minimum, then Caesar's is the AHJ.
How can you justify a contractor to do an audit? It's a non.
That would not have been my
Because
choice.
when we do audits,
This
we
is what
don't.
happens when things are developed by committee.
Okay.
So,
We don't
Yeah.
endorse product, we endorse technology, system, way. When it comes to a contractor, he will sell you a product?
I would not choose, I would say more generically, a vendor. I would not choose a vendor to do an audit on, for the system that they were going to replace. That's just a conflict of interest. You're going to, I've seen so many vendor calcs that started from a 2-year payback and worked backwards from there. So, and I'm not saying they all do that, but it happens. But yeah, I would not choose most contractors, I would say, as my sole qualification for doing an energy audit.
Okay. My last question is that on level 2, you don't do an energy model?
You don't have to, no.
How do you do a breakdown of the components based on estimate, based on some previous?
Essentially component models or spreadsheet models.
Yeah, but how do you justify synergy between EAMs without the model?
You can do that with spreadsheet calculations as well. They're estimates. That's why the requirement is that it hang together, that you, speaking for the industry, I would say most or many energy audits are done without whole building models because it's it's a huge scope to, like, if I want to exchange one air handler, why would I model the whole building to get back to that one air handler? I'm just going to do a spreadsheet simulation and estimate my loads based on what I know about that building or trend logs or whatever.
A few questions about life cycle costing. The installed cost, is that supposed to include hard costs and soft costs? In other words, design costs?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And
I think we said that specifically, hard costs and
Okay.
soft costs, yeah.
And the savings, do you set a utility rate or that's fixed over a period of time? Or do you escalate that and say, we're assuming 2%, 3% an increase?
We didn't dictate that.
Okay. So it's whatever you can agree with the AHJ, basically.
Exactly, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Because, and frankly, for energy prices, I don't know if you want to escalate energy prices or do you want to de-escalate them,
Next.
Just a comment on that. The federal government has software called BLCC5, which does have escalation rates for utility costs, and they do it by region and they do it by fuel type. So if you want to take that route, that's fine. The bigger problem I find is a lot of contractors will put in an annual escalation rate and then they'll add it all up, and they don't use a discount rate. And money has a time value, so if you want to apply the annual escalation rate, you also have to apply the discount rate, which reflects the cost of money. So if you want to do a true life cycle cost, it really should have a discount rate, not just an escalation rate. Mm-hmm. The other issue we had regarding who can do an energy audit, it's an ANSI standard, and as an ANSI standard, we were really limited as far as being able to pick a credential that would allow you to do an audit, and they did accept the federal website. If the federal government approved the credential, we could do that. And that's why it wound up the way it was. The issue with contractors, there's a lot of rural jurisdictions that don't have access to energy auditors, and so the only people doing the work are contractors. And we had a lot of discussion about whether to include a contractor or not. I kind of agree with Jim. The auditor should be an independent third party, not a person making a profit off of the equipment that's ultimately sold.
Although if it's an engineering firm that's doing the audit, I'm going to turn around and sell my engineers to do the design.
Yeah.
Right,
So there's
There's always an inherent conflict to a point, yeah.
true. It comes down to your relationship with the client and whether or not they trust that you're looking out for their best interests. Yeah.
So I just had I just had a quick question on the requirements, prerequisites. So if I were an owner or a client, I don't know if I would feel comfortable having someone who had only done like level 1 audits coming in and doing a level 3 audit. So is there any consideration given to that in the standard?
That's an interesting point. We didn't make that distinction. In fact, that's one thing I forgot to mention is that we very pointedly didn't lower the bar for level 1 audits in terms of qualifications. And really, I think it was Fred Goldner who kind of put his foot down on this one, but he was right, is that in a level 1 audit, you really want the most qualified person there if you're trying to make decisions about whether a project should go forward or not. You want somebody with very little time on site. You really want somebody who's experienced. So, but yeah, we didn't do the opposite and say that, you know, you could only, you know, perhaps we should have said in here that you can only become a qualified energy auditor by doing level 2 and higher or something like that, but we didn't do that. Yeah, that's good feedback.
I really like the BuildingSync idea and how to transfer data. We've done a lot of audits where we do one for the owner and then we do another one for the utility. Were any utilities at the table when you were talking? And is there any progress on kind of consolidating that so that you do an audit and then you can send it to the utility? I mean, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, we didn't have any utility representation as part of the committee. We did get some some feedback in our comments to draft versions. You know, there's a whole big public comment period, but we never got any comments from them on that issue. So, yeah, it's kind of not my flag to bear right now, but yeah, I hope somebody at one of the national labs is doing that because organizations like this are, I won't speak for EMA, I'll speak for ASHRAE, but ASHRAE is really good at writing standards and useful tools and really bad at getting anybody in the world to know about it. Like BEQ is the worst, you know, example of that where it's, you know, you have to spend marketing dollars on something to get something to take hold. And I don't know if there's anybody really in that position right now.